handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman, Seat, over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder, Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress, Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2 1. Grid to mark, Mike Charlie, 4 7 tree 9er, 8 9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds HEPT, gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience. You know, when we get into immigration discussions, there's just one go-to gal that I have in Washington, D.C., and that is Rachel Bovard, who is one of our top lieutenants over there at the Conservative Partnership Institute, where Jim DeMint is chairman, because Rachel runs up and down the hallways of the Hill trying to beat up people. And so she's agreed to spend some time with us on the immigration discussion. Imagine that. So, Rachel, thanks for all the work that you do and for giving us some time here on the Denise Simon Experience.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me back.
Jeez. I mean, we go from, well, let me start here. You run up and down the hallways, trying to, get the conservatives to step up their game. At this point, are we growing conservatives, or do they just seem to be, the Freedom Caucus and that's it?
I think the Freedom Caucus has done a really good job of, I think pushing the conference to the right, especially on immigration issues. You're starting to see people, try to face an issue head on that they've been trying to avoid for the last 10 years or so. You saw Kevin McCarthy, who's running for Speaker of the House, have to introduce a bill to authorize President Trump's border wall as a means to improve his credibility with the right. So all those things are good developments. But we're always lacking conservatives. We're always in the minority. I hope that a few more come up to join us here after Tuesday.
And yet even conservative media is mad at the Freedom Caucus because they're always seem to be the outcasts and not mainstream Republicans. So it's kind of really weird, isn't it?
But that's the role conservatives play a lot of times. They're never going to be the mainstream. They're always going to be, I think, pushing boundaries a little bit. That's the role. And there's a role for that. So I think they're filling a much needed aspect of the House. And I think their ranks are going to grow. What's interesting is that their ranks are going to grow, but the House majority are probably, if Republicans maintain the majority, the conference is going to shrink. And so I think the Freedom Caucus influence will be even more significant,
even greater
in Congress. Right.
Oh, God. Well, our fingers are crossed out here. We're getting inundated with all kinds of things, especially these cockamamie TV ads. So can't wait until some of this is over with. But you've been busy because you've been publishing some stuff on immigration. And I think what's forgotten here, Rachel, is that Trump really kind of gave the Democrats an open door, and they didn't bite, did they? Especially when it came to the Dreamers, correct?
No, that's right. We still haven't dealt with that issue. Democrats, refused to do a deal with the president, and there was nothing to get across the finish line. So that's still hanging out there.
So then he boiled it down to a 4-point plan. He needs a wall. I'll give you the Dreamers. Stop chain migration. I forget what the fourth one was. And somehow there's this memo that went out, obviously, because not one Democrat, not one, wants to talk about the immigration. In fact, they've been told not to talk about it at all. They want to stay on health care, correct?
Yeah, that's right. They do. And it's a shame, I think, because people need to be asking Democrats, what would you do with this border caravan? What would you do with these 7,000 people surging toward the border? Because I don't think they have a good answer. And I think it's a very interesting exercise because a lot of them are still sort of spewing open borders propaganda, which is not resonating well. So I think it's a question that they should be asked more than they are being asked.
Vice President Pence said something kind of interesting about a week ago, maybe a week and a half ago, that he had spoken to, somebody in Venezuela or somebody somewhere, and then it was Venezuela that said that they were actually helping this caravan, that they were providing some funding for it. And I kind of blew it off thinking, I'm not so sure how accurate that is. Somebody may be lying to Pence because Venezuela doesn't have any money. But then I thought about it again and thought, well, they really don't need a lot of money, do they? The caravan people.
Well, I do think it does take money and some sort of organizing structure to get, 7,000 people moving in the same direction on the same day, fed and housed to some extent. So there definitely is money involved here. In my own digging, it's a lot of the money seems to be connected to this group, People Without Borders, that's based and funded out of Chicago. So that definitely seems to be playing a role. It's hard to find obviously available evidence. I don't know what Pence is being told. I don't think that's available to the rest of us. But from what I can find, there's definitely activist groups that have been involved in this. The media portraying it as some organic movement of peoples is kind of ridiculous because that many people in the world's 3 poorest countries don't suddenly get up and all decide to leave on the exact same day.
What's fascinating is this caravan, and I need to say it plural because we're under the premise that there's now 3 of them. And we're told by General O'Shaughnessy, who is, head of Northern Command, that this caravan is different than the other ones. And something else has got to be going on here, that there's a missing component, unless I'm reading too much into it, such that we have got 2,100 National Guard, 800 that complied with, plus 800 that complied with the Department of Homeland Security request, and now 5,200. Rachel, something else is happening here, that we would put more on the border, including active military, than is really in the caravan. On top of border, something else is happening here.
Well, I think any time you have thousands of people that make a claim that they are going to cross your border legally or illegally, you want to propel that with a show of force. And it's also, that is just, it's a security risk. I think you see illegal immigration every day, but I think, this many people stating their intent to act illegally is that poses a significant risk at the border, and you don't know if they're going to come peaceably or they're going to come, not peaceably. And so I do think that troops on the border plus Border Patrol is a show of force by the U.S. to say, look, this is not acceptable. You can come here legally, you can get in line, but you cannot just willy-nilly break the law and cross the border.
Well, now we're at the premise, and it'd be interesting to see what some of these people on the Hill are saying to you, because they have been offered asylum in Mexico. So that changes the entire equation. And so any of those that deny that application process and continue to come here, that really takes the burden off the United States for having to extend them some kind of asylum application process, correct?
That's right. If they can get asylum in Mexico, that, would be something for Mexico to figure out. I think that's what people are telling them to do. And to be honest, when you are there's something called the first free country doctrine, and that's
correct.
Essentially the first free country that you pass into, you under international sort of norms, I guess, and law in some places where we have treaties signed, you are supposed to apply for asylum there, right? You can't continue to pass through and try to get, to your goal country. If you are truly seeking asylum, you are almost required by norm and law to do so in the first free country. And Mexico, for a lot of these folks, is that country.
When you're running up and down the hallways, are any of these legislators on the conservative side offering some kind of creative solutions or concepts or ideas on what to do with immigration that we haven't really talked about?
I think they're still keeping a focus on two things. I think border security. Obviously, there's a lot of members that want to build the wall, but second, Congressman Goodlatte out of Virginia has introduced a bill to reform the asylum process, because recognizing, I think that is what's driving a lot of this caravan, a lot of this illegal immigration. People are under the assumption, and it is correct, unfortunately, right now, that if they come here and claim asylum meet a very low threshold, which of credible fear, they will be allowed into the country and will be released into the interior. That is what happens. It's really incentivizing a lot of this illegal immigration, because people know they just have to cross and they can stay. They're given a court date to show up, obviously, to have their claim processed, but many times that's years in advance, because we don't have enough judges to process these claims. We don't have housing at the border. These are all resources questions. So until we can sort of address the border security and the resources, but we also need to address the drivers of illegal immigration. And right now, that's the asylum loopholes.
And so here's, I guess, a $64,000 question. Is it possible that an executive order can be signed, irrespective of this whole birthright, debate? But can there one be signed that says if you are applying for asylum, you will automatically be denied because you already went through a free country where they offered you asylum? Is that even remote? I mean, obviously that's going to get challenged, but I would say put it in the pipeline and let's get on with it.
That would have to be a congressional change. There's numerous statutes on the asylum process that would have to be modified. President Trump could try to do it by executive order, but again, it's not. I think it would take years to even try to go into effect, because it would be immediately challenged, and it could be undone, right, by the next guy. So, to really impact your asylum process, you need Congress to actually act, which obviously it has been very good at not doing on this issue.
Shucks. Okay. You see, I'm getting creative here, don't you?
Right. I know. We're all trying to find workarounds, but unfortunately, Article 1 of the Constitution is a hard thing to get around.
Well, yeah, and I'm not a proponent of doing that, but there is precedence where a previous president in particular, that's a lot of P's in that, actually did a couple of executive orders dealing with DAPA and DACA, and
right.
So
Republicans decried those as illegal. And rightly so. I do think I still continue to believe that those were way outside the realm of the executive. And so I want to, I don't want to encourage now that
bad on bad.
President Trump to kind of do the same thing. I would prefer Congress actually just get its act together, as would we all.
But Trump can undo an executive order from a previous sitting president, correct?
He could. And I think, I have no doubt that's under consideration. I think it's a situation where he would prefer, that the people's representatives deal with the issue, right? That to provide some kind of final remedy for whatever it's going to be, the DACA kids are still in limbo. Trump could easily undo the executive order. But I think I think it would not be that would force Congress to probably act in a way we don't want them to, which would be, they'd want to legalize everyone immediately.
Other than the Goodlatte bill, Rachel, are there any others out there that are filling in some cavernous voids in immigration that you're aware of?
No, not particularly. We had a pretty comprehensive debate about this back in the winter, and no really good solutions came out of it, to be honest. Republicans, seem pretty intent on trading some kind of amnesty for border security, which is obviously not what a lot of the people on the ground want necessarily. So, I'm hopeful that because this is such a pressing issue in the midterms, that Congress will at least be forced to deal with it at some point in December. When they return, they have a funding bill. They have to pass the Department of Homeland Security funding bill by December 7th. That may be, for a lot of Republicans, the last opportunity to pass Trump's border wall. So it would be great if a robust immigration discussion happened then.
When it comes to chain migration, was that a law, or was that just some kind of caveat regulation?
Right now, I understand that is a law about how who gets legal status, based on sort of related to and whatnot. So that should be changed by Congress as well. Again, immigration, there's a lot of areas for the president to act, but I think Trump wisely knows that his best option is to go through Congress first. If Congress continues to delay, and I wouldn't be surprised if Trump tried to insert himself, by executive order. But I think he wants a permanent change if possible.
Well, I mean, we certainly do, but I think these permanent changes have been tried many times, and we're just not advancing any of it. And that's what scares me, because I think 5 years from now we're going to be having the same discussion we're having today when it comes to immigration. I just, I don't see any real will to force the issue or to have some kind of a deal unless you put it in, you stuff it in some kind of a bundled other piece of legislation. And then that even has risks.
Right. And that, that's what I think would happen in December. If anything happens at all, it'll be in a part of a larger funding bill. Will be hopefully some immigration changes, wall funding, chain migration, the visa lottery. Any of those things could be included in this package at the end of the year.
I don't think that we saw anything, Rachel, when it came to the final agreement that we signed with Mexico that replaced NAFTA. Have you seen anything like that? The reason I ask is because I would think that part of the funding of the wall, remember Mexico is supposed to pay for it, would have been part of those discussions, but yet I don't see anything. And if it's was not part of those discussions, shame on us. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. The rhetoric out of the White House has definitely changed on that point. You don't hear them saying that Mexico is going to pay for it. You hear them asking Congress for the money. So I think it's safe to say that has been sidebarred, at least for now. Those discussions could still very well be going on, but the rhetoric and the tone out of Washington on that point, or out of the White House on that point, has definitely changed.
Well, whatever it was that we negotiated, and of course we haven't seen, I don't think anybody's seen the final replacement for NAFTA, but whatever it was that necessarily was changed when it came to tariffs, there's got to be some number of those dollars that could be stripped off, the funky accounting that Washington does, that could have been stripped off and put into a funding of the wall petty cash fund.
I mean, that's the hope, right? That was the campaign promise. Mexico was going to pay for it. So I think we're still waiting for the coffers to be full here.
Well, again, if there was any money to be saved when it out of the reworked NAFTA deal, I would think that there's, you could probably get, $800 million out of that one, but I don't know. Do you expect big things to then really happen in December? I hear some promise in your voice and in your responses.
Yeah, I think that we should expect action in December. That is the expectation we should go in with. This is, if we lose one or both majorities, Republicans, this will be the last chance for Republicans to get anything done. So I think there needs to be a push in December, for significant policy victories. The flip side of that is that there's also a chance there could be some very bad deals cut. Amnesty for the wall, a budget cap spending deal, all these things, the end of the year tends to be a grab bag for bad policies. So I think people need to be paying attention to what happens, pushing for the good stuff and watching out for the bad stuff. Something will happen. It's just a matter of kind of what it's going to be.
The Gang of Eight did that in the Senate, did the immigration reform thing that just obviously fell on the floor. Has anybody talked about necessarily pulling that out of the trash can and dusting it off and taking some piece parts? Because there were some decent piece parts in it that some things could be resurrected on the Senate side.
I haven't heard anyone talking about doing that yet. Again, I think it's been a lot of focus on sort of the wall and issues surrounding that. You have Senator Graham pushing for amnesty for the DACA recipients. So that hasn't been resurrected as a talking point yet. It's not to say, that won't be pulled up and dealt with when they return in December.
We heard this number of 11 million illegals in the United States for decades and decades, but yet MIT and Yale, I think, came out with that study, independent study, that said there's a minimum of 22 million, and it could be as high as 29 million. Did that report get any traction on the Hill?
I do think it did get around to the different offices, and people are chatting about it. But again, this is an issue that Congress loves to avoid.
Mm-hmm.
They know it's a problem. They've known it's a problem for years, and that hasn't spurred any action. It's spurred, stasis and avoidance, and that's still the situation we're in. It's literally taking 7,000 migrants churning toward the border for this to even be a point of discussion on the campaign trail, and that, I think, is very concerning for people who care about this issue. Trump is doing a good job of keeping in the headlines. And that's, again, it's the migrant caravan and Trump are the only two reasons we're talking about immigration right now.
Mm-hmm. And you haven't seen any kind of light on in the underneath the doorway that says we're going to hold some congressional hearings on this whole thing, even that necessarily got proposed by the Democrat side?
I don't think so. I don't think we're going to see anything. So,
yeah, I really think we're overdue to talk about a real presentation in some congressional hearings that says this is what illegal immigration does to healthcare, this is what it does to education, this is what it does to transportation, this is what it, all of those things, so we can begin to throw some dollars and the cost of all of it on the table, such that it would be really shocking to some of those that are pro-immigration, right?
No, I think that's right. I think a healthy discussion of a lot of these topics is what we need. And one thing in particular I feel like is not brought up enough by the mainstream press is the fact that, you're trying to fix the illegal immigration problem for our security and sovereignty, but it's also a humanitarian issue. I mean, the more people are incentivized to come here, the more they put themselves at risk for exploitation by drug traffickers, sex traffickers. So this is not simply about, keeping America free of illegal aliens. This is about not creating a danger for people who are coming here by incentivizing them to do so illegally.
There are so many moving parts. When I think I have a handle on it all, I soon find out that I don't have that handle on things at all. I'm not as, involved in it as you, because I'm obviously not walking up and down the hallways of the Hill, but the Capitol building. But I think we need to learn more about it all, and I really would like to have a hearing. I'd like to have a hearing on Obamacare, because I think that's well overdue. There should have been a 2-day hearing when we tried to go through the whole repeal and replace thing, but that's water over the bridge here at this point. Right. I think that Rachel, we're real grateful for your time and the stick-to-itiveness on this topic. I'm just sad that we can't seem to advance the Good Lot bill, which isn't perfect, but it's the best thing we've got so far. And I hope I can be as positive and forward-leaning as you are with what could happen in December.
Well, something's going to happen. I mean, let's be on the lookout. It might not be positive, but it will be something.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, big round of applause to Rachel Bovard. We're happy that you were with us. And ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way. Stay tuned.
About to join Don Newen, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio, and Denise Simon, host of the Denise Simon Experience, for a weekly situation report, or SITREP. 18 hours a day, Denise Simon lives her life as an intel analyst. 18 hours a day, Don Newen lives his life in the world of rock and roll. 1 hour each day, Newen receives a daily SITREP from Simon. Welcome to the Drive Time Situation Report. Fasten your seatbelt. You're now in Don Newen's car, and he is calling in for his SITREP.
Check the Talk America Radio schedules for showtimes at talkamericaradio.us.
Let me talk to you, black people. When you vote for blacks and put them in office under the banner of the Democrat Party, please explain to me what black people get as a result. This was not a nap that we have been taking. We are in a coma. You know what the interesting thing about pensions is? That's today's money given to people who ain't doing nothing for you today. Get off that black Democrat tit that they've been sucking on. Your country is being stolen from you, and the promise is being stolen from your children, and they're telling you it's all right while the rest of the world is trying to lap us. Well, why are we doing so poorly? 2 words: teachers' unions. Are you kidding me?
Black Man Thinking, Monday nights, 9 p.m.
Hi, this is Donna Fiducia, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio. For 28 years, I was in the mainstream media, most recently as an anchor at the Fox News Channel. No more. Ladies and gentlemen, the mainstream media has completely failed the American people. Radio networks like Talk America Radio will not fail you. Radio shows like Cowboy Logic Radio will not fail you. Check out the entire roster of over 60 weekly radio shows by visiting talkamericaradio.us. That's talkamericaradio.us.
TalkAmericaRadio.us.
Can we do it again? I like it.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for hanging with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. Ryan Mauro is with us, a previous guest, kind of my go-to guy, but Ryan's over at the Clarion Project, and you can find the work at clarionproject.org. And he's just like always busy uncovering things that need to be uncovered. And interestingly enough, there's not a lot of media play when there should be. So we're going to actually talk about Al-Qaeda. So with that, Ryan, welcome to the Denise Simon Experience.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
All right, look. We've got some reports here. My buddy over in Britain, Kyle Orton, wrote a fascinating piece about Iran's connections to Al-Qaeda. And he and a few others at the Henry Jackson Society did some remarkable work. And what is particularly interesting is it puts things in context about the history of Iran and Al-Qaeda. Then we've had a couple of legal cases that have gone through our court system here where we can merge the two. Then recently we had this cockamamie weird thing that happened in, what was it, New Mexico with this compound?
Yeah, New Mexico.
Okay. And this cat was obviously an Al-Qaeda sympathizer. And then, you see, I'm really setting you up here, so the rest of the show is yours. And then we have these sanctions that were lifted against Iran under the Obama administration that the Trump administration has just now placed back on Iran. So I would argue, and I think you're going to agree with me, but maybe not, that based on the aggressive posture that the United States is taking on Al-Qaeda and all these factions, especially what's going on in Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and then North Africa, that Al-Qaeda is going to be back on the rise again. And if it isn't already. And your piece, or the piece that was over at the Clarion Project, speaks to the funding that is again coming from the United States through mosques back into Al-Qaeda factions. Are we seeing a real pattern here, or am I just making too much of it?
I think you're seeing a pattern, and you're seeing all sorts of colliding trends where there's positive trends because you have the sanctions on Iran and you have the Iranian people increasingly angry at the Iranian regime. But then you have the negative trend where Al-Qaeda is rising as ISIS is falling. And so it becomes difficult for people to know if we're winning, if we're losing, and what the future holds. And it really depends on which metric you're using and which trend ends up holding out and ultimately defining the future. And that's what makes this really so difficult. As for Al-Qaeda, there's the first reason that they're going to be rising up is simply because ISIS is getting just destroyed. I mean, they're literally at about 1% of the territory that they used to hold. And so a lot of the people that were attracted to ISIS are going to say, well, where do we turn to next? Obviously, Allah did not bless ISIS. They're getting destroyed. Something was wrong with what they were doing. Who was their main competitor? Who is the closest thing to ISIS that is not getting destroyed and therefore may have God's blessing? And the answer to that would be Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda's various affiliates who don't use the name Al-Qaeda, but everyone knows they are part of them. And that would be particularly strong in Yemen and in Syria, where Al-Qaeda has literal armies. They didn't ever have that before. It used to be just terrorists and terrorists from a multitude of jihadist groups kind of coming together, and Al-Qaeda, which means the base, would kind of coordinate them as the base. Now you have actual armies fighting on the battlefield. Domestically within the United States, there's a sharp increase in support for Al-Qaeda partially because of the fall of ISIS, people just kind of turning back to Al-Qaeda. But it's also because they're what we are seeing through our sources is an increase in radicalization among African-American converts, particularly those with criminal records. And Al-Qaeda is gaining more traction than ISIS nowadays for various reasons. But the biggest contributing reason, and it's one that a lot of people have a responsibility for, is this narrative that the U.S. government is out to get you, that it's tyrannical, that, yeah, you live in the United States, but you're not really an American, and the American government claims to be free and a democratic republic, and it is not. And once you start convincing lots of people that the U.S. government is truly against you and oppressing you, and our democracy is a mirage, well, then they're going to look to other philosophies. And Al-Qaeda is there offering another philosophy.
We found out, too, that the Taliban 5 that Obama released out of Guantanamo Bay that went to Qatar, and Qatar kept them detained, and I say that loosely, for some time, are now part of the Taliban diplomatic post in Doha. And now we are in these talks with the same Taliban 5, with Zalmay Khalilzad as the head envoy. How he got chosen, I don't know, but that's a topic for another day. And it was the Taliban that was protecting Al-Qaeda. So I would argue that we probably have some newly resurrected from the old connections that are being reestablished. And the best place to do that is through domestic mosques. Is that overstated?
I think what might be a little overstated is the role of the mosques, even the radical ones connected to the Muslim Brotherhood, to the spike that we're seeing in people who are joining Al-Qaeda. Some are a little bit radical, and then they just go at light speed ahead to a level 10 radicalism, and now they're talking about constructing bombs. There are some Muslims who aren't really practicing, don't really know their faith, they get a little into it, and then they just go, boom, right to Al-Qaeda. And that all happens on the internet with mentors, from online propaganda. You can almost have your own, essentially a mosque online. I mean, if you have a gigantic Facebook group or something like that, and it's a whole bunch of radicals there that are meeting and conversing and sharing information and studying together, that's essentially kind of a mosque. I mean, we have online churches We have online Christian groups, Bible studies, so we have to assume the same thing's happening with radical Islam as well. So sometimes, even though I am a critic of the leadership of the mosques in the United States for failing to confront this ideology in a very deep, meaningful way, I think sometimes there's a little bit too much emphasis put on the mosques as a meeting point and an organizing point for terrorists. That being said, what you can blame mosques for is that if they had a really robust secular democratic ideology, a really patriotic ideology being pushed aggressively, then that would change the problem tremendously. It would change it so much more for the better, because you would have an overwhelming amount of preaching and literature countering the Al-Qaeda type Islamist narrative, believing in an Islamic state, and you don't have that happening right now. So I guess that's kind of a long-winded answer of saying it really depends on how you look at it, how you look at the problem. Individual operatives may be meeting online, more so from mosques. In many cases, they're kicked out of the mosques. But the generic foundation and understanding of Islam, where does that come from? It does come from the mainstream Islamic leadership and the groups that control the majority of the mosques.
These financial contributions, I think that the Trump administration's probably cracking down on some of the entitlements that seem to go from government to various entities. And because of some of that crackdown, some of these factions may be hurting financially. So are the Al-Qaeda sympathizers and I guess little lieutenants out there, are they looking for additional methods of funding because entitlements seem to be maybe perhaps drying up some?
Absolutely. There's, in terms of entitlements, there's a few different ways that jihadists handle that. On the one hand, they like to make it sound as if that is proof that the U.S. government keeps you poor so that it supplies you with money and then can control you. So they view it in a very conspiratorial way, even if they take advantage of those government benefits programs. They view it as strong evidence for the need for an Islamic state and a debunking of why the United States is a great country, a debunking of why our ideology claims to be all these wonderful things, but in practice actually is not. And then on the other hand, part of the reason that they like those benefits being there, aside from, in many cases, many of them just genuinely need them, it is the fact that it is more legitimate in the minds of jihadists to defraud government entities than it is to do something like just attack someone on a corner and steal their wallet. There's different degrees of what's justified for a lot of these jihadists. And so going back to the 80s, what you would see is very sophisticated programs being launched by jihadist criminals in order to engage in ID fraud, workers' compensation fraud, welfare fraud, unemployment, whatever type of fraud they can think of, they go after. And if it's taking money from entities that they think are in general controlled by the Jews, like the banks, then it's justified. If it's a government entity like post offices, then that's justified. So part of the reason that you see this emphasis on obtaining these type of monies is actually theologically based rather than just a matter of need and because it's available.
We've got various Al-Qaeda factions. I mean, as you said earlier, they've got all kinds of different names. And I'm going to throw this out there because it was in the news, I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago, and then it just kind of went away. And that was this Somali daycare center operations that was going on in Minnesota, where government monies were going in to augment the cost of childcare, and then some of those monies ended up in terror factions in Somalia. Do you have a sense of where some of that or any part of that case is today?
I haven't gotten an update on it recently, but yeah, it makes sense. And usually whenever there is a prosecution like this, in the vast majority of cases, there are more entities involved that the government is aware of and going to prosecute, or the government and every reasonable person looking at the situation knows are involved, but lack the evidence to prosecute. Whenever that is an important thing for people to understand, that even when it comes to people, much more so businesses, the amount that gets investigated is a portion of those that we know are engaging this type of activity, and only a portion then get selected for prosecution because the evidence is strong enough. And then what we know is only a tiny portion of what we don't know. So when you hear these cases, you have to assume that the true problem is actually much bigger. And this type of case has precedent. I'm aware of a terror-tied group in California that used to have 400 acres in one of their compounds before it was abandoned in 2002. But they got about $2 million in taxpayer money because they ran a charter school and they lied about how many students went there, forged signatures, and for each student that was enrolled at that charter school, they got government assistance. They took the government assistance and they used it to pay for their own efforts, and they shipped the rest to Pakistan. So this type of thing goes on more often than I think people realize.
And that's pretty much the same kind of model that you described in California is what happened with this operation in Minnesota. And obviously it worked for some time. And then, it just kind of left the headlines. Nobody speaks about it anymore, which tells me somebody was told to shut up, because I think that there's something to it all. And, we're talking about a lot of money. I mean, millions and millions of dollars. And the donations of federal dollars was based on per child that was, there, like you just said. I mean, it's all done, I think, on state and federal tax dollars on child care assistance programs. So it sounds like a great cover to have monies leave the United States to go crazy places, Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, wherever else, right?
Yep, definitely. And if you were a jihadist criminal or just a criminal seeking to profit off the jihadists, maybe you agree with them a little bit, but you weren't ready to kill yourself for the sake of the cause. All of this makes sense. It's really just there for the taking. And if you're really smart, you're probably not going to get caught. The unfortunate reality is that those that get caught tend to be those that make a reckless mistake. And people don't like to hear it because it's unsettling, but it's true. If you really know how our intelligence services operate, how much evidence is needed to warrant an investigation, and then to move that investigation to a prosecution and a conviction, you can get away with a lot of this stuff. Even if you end up getting caught, what gets you in trouble might only be a portion of what you did. You'll still be able to accomplish a lot, and your accomplices will as well. And that's part of why I think you've seen so relatively few attacks on American soil since even the 80s, even include 9/11. Yes, there was a high death toll there, but if you look at the potential for chaos within the United States and how easy it is to carry out an attack, you have to sometimes scratch your head and wonder, well, how come there haven't been more attacks? How come there haven't been bigger attacks? And the reason is, above almost any other reason, is the fact that these jihadist groups like operating here. Our freedom and our dysfunction, in many cases, it allows them to prosper. And so if they're getting so much funding and recruits from American soil, even if we are the great Satan, then they're not going to want to destroy the great Satan yet. They have other things to worry about, and they can profit and build up in the meantime at our expense.
Well, since we have done away with Anwar al-Awlaki, who was the senior al-Qaeda leader that was killed in Yemen, and I think Zawahiri's still out there somewhere, correct?
Correct.
Who's carrying the baton now for al-Qaeda?
Well, Zawahiri is officially the head, so he's the manager, but he's not really a captivating figure, even though he's been around since the late 80s. So there's a lot of respect for him. He's extremely effective in terms of organization building. He rivals bin Laden. But it's actually bin Laden's son is being prepped as the new face, so they're introducing him more and more in videos and referencing him. But I would not say he's quite really carrying the torch for them anymore. He just doesn't seem like there's a huge amount of fanfare from the jihadi populations whenever he speaks. So they're still working on that, building up the prestige of bin Laden's son. In terms of radicalization, I would say Anwar al-Awlaki is still probably, even though he's dead, the leading radicalizer, because it's his sermons going around on a lot of the jihadi accounts that I monitor as part of Clarion Intelligence Network, and the sermons that he put together that are the most popular aren't even about jihad. So, for example, one time I was going through different accounts on my computer, and I minimized the tab, and I didn't know what was going to be playing next, and I heard a pretty powerful, pithy sermon, or like a soundbite, like a 2-minute soundbite against atheism from an Islamic preacher. And I thought, wow, that was pretty compelling and articulate. I'm not surprised that one's being shared around. And I pulled it up, and it was Anwar al-Awlaki. And so that's how a lot of people will get introduced to the Al-Qaeda type ideology. It won't be because they're saying, I want to learn about jihad. It'll be that they come across a preacher talking about something unrelated, and they become a fan of his sermons, and then they come across the jihadist ones after that cleric has already impressed them as an articulate authority. And al-Awlaki is probably the best one out there in terms of that horrible skill set. There are a couple other preachers out there that are radicalizing a lot of people, particularly for ISIS. There's a guy named Imam Jibril out of Michigan who just has a massive online fan base, and you can see his material still being spread throughout the internet. There's an Imam Faisal who's currently in prison. He was from the Caribbean. But I would say those are the main guys. It's those two ISIS supporters right now, and al-Awlaki.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're speaking with Ryan Mauro at the Clarion Project. Ryan, here's a curveball for you. The documents that came out of the bin Laden compound in Abbottabad, we've only gotten probably 24 of those that have been declassified. Is there, tell us your thoughts on why more haven't, if not all haven't been declassified?
Well, there is a list of the different types of documents that have been captured and processed from bin Laden's compound. And even if each individual document has not been released, you can see titles for most, if not all of them now. There was initially a long delay in releasing some of these documents, and it was rumored by a lot of people that part of the reason was because it showed ties between Iran and Al-Qaeda, that the Obama administration did not want out there, particularly when they were pursuing this nuclear deal with the Iranians. The Trump administration came in, those documents were released, and the rumors were correct. It showed a much tighter relationship between Iran and Al-Qaeda than was previously known, and the information in there had no real reason to be kept secret. There weren't it didn't have a ton of operational details that would endanger Americans if they were released. These documents were kept for political reasons. Now, we don't know what else is being kept. Even with this long list of different types of documents that bin Laden had, there were a lot of documents on his computer. And we also don't know what other documents we've gotten from subsequent arrests due to that raid in Abbottabad. Overall, there is a problem beyond politics, but a big problem in overclassification, where anything and everything that touches the government just gets automatically classified. And it stays that way for a very long time automatically, and then if someone hears about it, you can try to get it declassified, but even that is a fight. And this difficulty, this big problem with transparency within the U.S. government, then encourages propaganda, conspiracy theory, and things like that. And they're really neat, even if it's not a top issue, it's important enough of an issue that I would hope at some point we come up with some better system, better way of doing things, so that things are released to the public in a faster way, instead of just classifying everything and then analysts, when someone files a Freedom of Information Act request, an analyst who already has a huge pile just saying, national security, can't release it, move on to the next one, which is what happens when you go through the process.
After the first of the year, my gut tells me that we may be hearing a lot more about Al-Qaeda. If you have a prediction on the future of Al-Qaeda, what would it be?
I'm struggling internally to answer that because there are two paths Al-Qaeda could take, and it's hard to tell if they're going to try to do both, or if they're going to pick one, or if they were smart, they would just form a whole new group. But they're not going to do that. It involves too much pride of saying we did something when it comes to Al-Qaeda. But they have a choice to make. On the one hand, they can try to inspire and carry out attacks within the United States like they have been. Mm-hmm. And to some degree, I think they may feel obliged to do so, because if they don't do that, then it looks like they're losers, and they are losers. Mm-hmm. And then the other strategy that they're trying overseas, but they may want to double down on, is appearing as the moderate alternative to
Islamic State,
to ISIS, and even to their own old Al-Qaeda guard, by not massacring tons of civilians in the streets, by focusing on social services, moderating their messaging, looking at the success of the Muslim Brotherhood and the success of ISIS, and kind of fusing the two together so that they're more successful as a movement, but they are not over the top like ISIS was and end up shooting themselves in the feet.
So, Al-Qaeda, if I'm hearing it right, will always be out there in some form or fashion, and they're probably trying to determine what model, what operational, functional playbook to endorse this point going forward. Is that right?
Yep, that's right. I think there is a bit of a struggle going on as to how to move forward in the post-ISIS world.
Yeah, and we have seen some pretty nastiness in other areas of the world. The Philippines and Southeast Asia, even in China. So we're seeing some other activities. And I'm really pleased that you were able to share some of this with us, because we're not going to get it in the news as long as we're in an election cycle. But I appreciate the work that you're doing, ladies and gentlemen. It's Ryan Mauro, and please go visit clarionproject.org. They're doing some work that is remarkable work that needs to be understood, needs to be read and shared, because you're not going to get it anywhere else. So with that, thanks, Ryan. Certainly appreciate your time and your explanation and having things in context. Well done.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way, so stay with us.
You can't handle the truth. The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress. Mike Charlie 4 Tree 5 9er 2-1. Grid to mark. Mike Charlie 4-7 Tree 9er 8-9er out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck. 2 rounds AGBT. Cast TOT 5-3.
And now,
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for hanging with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. I want you to know I have a white man on with us who Don Lemon now says is a threat to the United States. Seton Motley is a friend.
I have a
quasi
travel
neighbor.
ban in place, but it's self-imposed. Go ahead.
Self-imposed travel ban. And Seton runs. He's the founder of lessgovernment.org. Is it .org?
Yes, it's exactly right. The suffix of the nonprofit. Yes.
Okay. Well, welcome, Seton, and
thank you.
You know, I'm happy that you have written about China. I noticed that National Review has written about China. I've written about China so many times I can't even stand it any longer. So I was hoping that somebody else would kind of pick up the baton, and you did. But your particular bent on China, which you can find, ladies and gentlemen, over at Red State, because he made a big contribution over there. And that is that the Defense Department seems to be wanting to outsource, and they have been outsourcing some of their backups and some of their firewalls and protections to non-government cyber experts kind of thing. And they keep putting things out. They keep, you know, we got Amazon, Jeffrey Bezos, which is, you know, also happens to own the Washington Post. And I don't think that's a very good idea, doing cloud services with them through the Department of Defense. But then I digress. But I guess the big question here is, one of the most secure places we have is NSA. Why are we not expanding NSA so the Defense Department could be co-locating with NSA? Or is that just a logical... help me out, Seton.
Well, you know, here's the thing. Okay, let me give a brief history. The JEDI, it stands for something, a joint... you know, I always get lost in acronym land in D.C. But anyway, it's the Defense Department is looking to outsource its cloud computing backup for everything it's doing. It seems to want to do a similar source. Now, when this process first started, Amazon, for some unknown reason, had an inside track to the job. Well, you just do a little research, and you come to find that Barack Obama's Defense Department had hired a bunch of ex-Amazon employees and put them in charge of the JEDI contracting process. And
wait. Did you know that Jeffrey Bezos lives on the same street, owns a house on the same street as Barack Obama as we speak?
Which is amazing, because Barack Obama's never had a job.
That's a sidebar. Keep going.
Yes. So Barack Obama hired all these ex-Amazon employees who then draft the contractor description in such a way that only Amazon can meet it. So, thankfully, the Trump administration comes in, and he appointed an IG to look at the process, and in like 2 days he went, yeah, this isn't right, we're basically pulling back and starting over. So that was good. So now we're in this bidding process. Meanwhile, of course, Amazon's still in the process.
And then we had Google.
Well, Google employees, Google was in the bidding. Google employees staged a mutiny and said, we don't want to be helping the U.S. war machine, and we don't want our company sullying its reputation by working with the Defense Department. Oh, but yes, let's go back for our 21st year of bending over for the communist Chinese. That we can do. That's no problem. That doesn't sully our brand's good name. The Microsoft employees also wrote an open letter to their bosses saying, we don't want to be part of this either after Google quit. Google did pull out of the bidding process.
But Google beat out IBM and then bailed on the contract.
Well, they didn't get the contract. They didn't beat anybody. This particular contract, nobody's gotten it yet. It's still open for bid. So anyway, so that's still open for bid. It's still going. So Microsoft is still in it, even though their employees wrote a letter on Medium.com. So anyway, Amazon's still in the running, and there are several issues I have with. Well, first of all, I don't think any one company should get the whole damn thing. That makes no sense.
Exactly.
You need backups, and you don't have backups if one company's provide anyway. So one of the problems Amazon has is they go offline a lot. Not just the retail, not just the Amazon retail site, but their Amazon Web Services go offline a lot. And additionally, there was a story in Bloomberg late last week about China planting spy chips on Amazon and Apple products. And now, I said it in the piece, and I'll say it here, Amazon and Apple both vociferously said that did not happen. They've been going after Bloomberg to retract the story. And Bloomberg, as of my last reading, had not retracted the story. I'm in the uncomfortable position of having to decide who to believe, big tech or the media. So I'm in no man's land on that. But that made me think, okay, how deeply enmeshed in China is Amazon? So I started looking around, and sure enough, they're deeply enmeshed in China. They have a cloud computing deal that they partnered with a Chinese government company on in China. They're doing all kinds of retail in China. As we know, it's not free entry into the Chinese marketplace. The Chinese government extracts things from you. They extract IP handovers. They extract tech handovers. They extract all kinds of things that we don't even know about. And these guys are over a barrel with China, not like Apple is. I mean, Apple's entire manufacturing, I think, is in China. So they're completely screwed in about 5 years when China really goes to town. But anyway, I digress. Amazon's too enmeshed in China for me to feel comfortable saying, hey, Department of Defense, give them all your secrets. I'm not comfortable with that.
Well, I'm going to do a story topper, I think, and this ought to raise some eyebrows, so I'm glad we're actually talking about what China, I mean, they're clearly not friends, but yet Don Lemon can't seem to, never mind. There was a report that came out between the U.S. War College and Tel Aviv University. And in this report, China is actually siphoning off internet traffic in Asia, all of Asia, and they're taking it, they're copying it, so there's a 15-20 minute delay, and then they're putting it back on the broadband pipes. So I said, what? I mean, everything travels through the internet. Everything.
Yeah, they're probably scanning it for stuff they don't want to get through to their citizens.
Well, no. This is trade. This is, I mean, it's just anything that goes on the internet. So I reached out.
Tough to issue a stock purchase with that going on.
So I reached out to one of the authors, Dr. Chris Demchek, who is with the War College, the United States Naval War College, and I said, hey, will you do an interview on this? And he said, well, thank you for the invitation, but I must decline. So I thought, well, somebody's probably said you need to shut up about this after this report went out. My whole point with this is that I just don't think we have a full handle on what in the world China is actually doing to not only the United States, but to any of our allies. And we can't seem to get anybody in Congress to determine if any of this is beginning to cross the line to an act of war. Can we?
Well, yeah, no, I'm totally with you. And China's been throwing around money in Washington for decades. I mean, if you'll remember, the 1996 Bill Clinton reelect had millions of dollars funneled in from the Chinese. Remember that? Charlie Tree and
yeah.
And we gave them nuclear secrets from a base in Arizona. Remember that? So the Chinese, the communists love those 10-year plans and 50-year plans, and China's got a 50-year plan. It's 2030 to dominate the world.
Correct.
And they're on schedule. I mean, they're I'm constantly watching China, reminded of the Vladimir Lenin line. Vladimir Lenin, of course, the Russian who basically was responsible for the execution of the last czars in Russia to incept the Soviet Revolution in Russia. And he said the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we will hang them. And that's China. That's what's happening here. And, in looking this up, I thought, I thought it was a little more than this. They only own $1.2 trillion of our debt. I thought it was a little more than that. That's relatively reassuring. That was the only reassuring thing I found in all my research for this piece. But, they've spent, billions of dollars they dumped them into colleges to set up, pro-China teaching programs. They're buying politicians going back to Clinton's in the 90s. They're even buying up now because, of course, they're government subsidized. So they're coming in and underbidding all our companies and buying up passenger rail routes, train routes in America. I mean, this is all going on. So, I don't see, and we keep inviting these people over to our colleges, educating them and sending them back. It's insane. It's insane. There is so much wrong with our colleges. The indoctrination, but then this whole Saudi influence, the jihadi influence globally that's in colleges, the communist Chinese influence in colleges.
The Confucius Institute. And the only two senators that ever put any pressure on some of these universities about the Confucius Institutes, plural, is Cruz and Rubio. Isn't that fascinating?
Right. Well, yeah, Rubio's good on China. I think he's a little too overly sensitive. Look, the Jamal Khashoggi, how do you pronounce his name?
Jamal Khashoggi.
Khashoggi. Look, what that the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia is engaged in reforms and modernizations. He is. Now, he's got to do it very, very slowly because that's all the people will accept. But one of the things he has to do is, to the best of his ability, minimize the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood in Saudi Arabia.
And
Khashoggi was a Muslim Brotherhood stooge. Mm-hmm. So he dealt with him. Now, they deal with their problems a little less daintily than do we. So Khashoggi goes away, and Rubio's so myopically focused on, oh my God, he killed a journalist. Well, he wasn't a journalist.
No, that was a cover.
Muslim Brotherhood mouthpiece.
Exactly.
So Rubio, he's got his antenna up on foreign policy, but his receiver isn't always working.
Well, at least he is ringing the bell on some things Russia, and certainly on some things China.
Well, now again, I think he's wrong on the Russia thing. I mean, the joke now is since the fall of the Soviet Union, they're a gas station with a nation attached, and now that Trump's finally accessing our oil, their gas station isn't making any money anymore. So they're not really a threat. And to me, one of the biggest strategic losses of the last 2+ years was we should have been working with Russia or cozying up to Russia to get them to side with us against China. Because China is the problem, not Russia. And because of this stupid Trump-Russia collusion stupidity, he couldn't do that because it would look like...
Yeah.
It would feed the narrative of this stupid, non-existent collusion stuff. So that's a big loss because now you can look, Russia and China are doing more and more stuff together because China looked at it and said, okay, we'll partner with them, that's fine. And so thanks to domestic Democrat politics, we lost a real opportunity there.
And don't you find it kind of interesting that the other committee members on the Senate Foreign Relations and the Senate Intelligence, Not one single Democrat, not one, either in the House or the Senate, has said one word about China.
Well, Feinstein's made millions of dollars.
Exactly.
And I bet you money she knew that 20-plus year spy was a spy.
Sure.
I mean, that was part of the trade-off, was having a Chinese staffer on her staff as she's the Democrat leader of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I mean, this is insane. She should be in prison just for having this person on staff for 20 years and being criminally stupid and not realizing it if she didn't. It reminds me of that line from West Wing when the Republicans are investigating the Bartlett administration, and the two young staffers, he goes, I'm looking at this deposition. You get dangerously close to what do you call it when you lie under oath?
Perjury.
Perjury, because you get dangerously close to perjury. I'd like to investigate you two for being stupid. And that's kind of like how I feel about Dianne Feinstein. So anyway, that's why. I mean, they've been throwing money around. This is part of the plan. They've been throwing money around D.C. and America for decades, and it
How
shuts
bad
people
of
up.
scandal? What kind of scandal would it be if we started to expel some Chinese diplomats from the West Coast?
Well, we have to come up with an official justification for doing so, which I don't think would be too hard, but I don't, it wouldn't be any more of a scandal than anything else that's a scandal. Everything Trump does is a scandal, which in a way helps, because if everything's a scandal, nothing's a scandal,
Right.
And he knows this, and he's got this constant cacophony, which has got to be, I'm exhausted watching it. I can't imagine being the recipient of it. And, this constant barrage and assault of stupidity from all these people. And but it gives him room to operate. There's this one leftist woman on my Facebook. She's a Facebook friend. I've never met her. She's a hardcore leftist. She's an environmentalist all the way. She does that for a living. I don't know in what capacity. But anyway, she's a realistic, smart person. She is so angry at this Trump-Russia collusion thing because she knows it's total nonsense. But what she's pissed about is all the other things we should be mad at Trump at, but we're not because we're mad at him for Trump-Russia collusion. Which that's an interesting leftist perspective, and she's right. He's getting a lot of stuff done.
In spite of
it, it's like the magician. You're watching the right hand, and he's doing the trick with his left hand. It's misdirection.
Well,
but it's not Trump's fault. They're the ones setting up the misdirection. He's just walking in and doing what he wants to do.
As long as we're in this trade negotiations, trade/war negotiations with China, I'm thinking that is probably one of the reasons that we're not taking any more aggressive diplomatic anti-China activities, especially when we just indicted.
In Trump's defense, I always thought, as I defended Trump, and of course we're now being proven correct, in his trade wars, I said China's going to be last for a bunch of reasons.
Yeah, I get that.
One, they'll hold out longer than anybody else. And two, he's folding in a bunch of non-trade related things into the negotiations with China. There's North Korea, for example.
Exactly.
He's pardon the use of the phrase, he's trading off gaining ground on our trade relationship with China in exchange for gaining ground on nuclear North Korea.
Correct.
So he's making that, and I think his math is correct. I think corralling North Korea is more important than getting some of the trade barriers removed from our entryway into China. I think he's made the right calculations in that regard. So he's got that going on. And I think that has been part of the negotiation thinking with regard to China. He's got non-trade things that he has to deal with that are more important than trade things.
Which is the reason I think that they're reticent and really holding back on being more aggressive with the nasty things that China is doing against the United States.
There's a cultural aspect to this too. The Asians always worry about saving face. You can't talk about Xi Jinping the way you talk about, Macron in France. You can't. Being respected. Respect is very important in Asia.
Correct.
We say it's important here, but not like it is there.
Correct.
And so he understands this. He's been there 9,000 times on business. So Xi Jinping, he's my buddy. He's a great guy. Blah blah blah. Plus, if you beat the guy up in public, you can't even sit down with the person. And even if you do, after you've beaten him up in public, what's he going to concede in private? What you have to do is you have to publicly praise him and then privately admonish him.
Well, I think we have some interesting things that will happen after the midterms with regard to China. They're clearly, I think we ought to go on a tweet up with Don Lemon and have him replace the white men with China. But
meanwhile, he's dating a white man. He is. Yeah. They may be married. I don't know, but he's dating a white man. I mean, I wonder what he thought when he saw that.
Well, I appreciate your insight, and I'm happy to see that you and Bill Gertz and, those over at National Review are picking up this baton when it comes to China. I think that we're leaving an awful lot unsaid, and it's important that, we kind of push the matter. And good job on the piece with the Department of Defense that you did over at Red State. It is a little on the snarky side, but I understand the snarkiness because we're just not making good decisions here with the Department of Defense. If they want some protections, then go knock on the door at the National Security Agency. Yeah,
we have a giant server farm in Utah. Why can't we use that?
That's kind of my point. Ladies and gentlemen, big round of applause to Seton Motley, and thank you for being with us, and there's more coming your way, so make sure you stay with us.
About to join Don Newen, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio, and Denise Simon, host of the Denise Simon Experience, for a weekly situation report, or SITREP. 18 hours a day, Denise Simon lives her life as an intel analyst. 18 hours a day, Don Newen lives his life in the world of rock and roll. 1 hour each day, Newen receives a daily SITREP from Simon. Welcome to the Drive Time Situation Report. Fasten your seatbelt. You're now in Don Newen's car, and he is calling in for his SITREP.
Check the Talk America Radio schedules for showtimes at talkamericaradio.us.
Let me talk to you, black people. When you vote for blacks and put them in office under the banner of the Democrat Party, please explain to me what black people get as a result. This was not a nap that we have been taking. We are in a coma. You know what the interesting thing about pensions is? That's today's money given to people who ain't doing nothing for you today. Get off that black Democrat tit that they've been sucking on. Your country is being stolen from you, and the promise is being stolen from your children, and they're telling you it's all right while the rest of the world is trying to lap us. Well, why are we doing so poorly? 2 words: teachers' unions. Are you kidding me?
Black Man Thinking, Monday nights, 9 p.m.
Hi, this is Donna Fiducia, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio. For 28 years, I was in the mainstream media, most recently as an anchor at the Fox News Channel. No more. Ladies and gentlemen, the mainstream media has completely failed the American people. Radio networks like Talk America Radio will not fail you. Radio shows like Cowboy Logic Radio will not fail you. Check out the entire roster of over 60 weekly radio shows by visiting talkamericaradio.us. That's talkamericaradio.us.
TalkAmericaRadio.us.
Can we do it again? I like it.
And thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for hanging with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. I got the distinct pleasure of having Rob Bluey with us, who's the editor-in-chief of Daily Signal, something that I suggest all of you subscribe to. But he's also a Steelers fan, which is even better. So the conversation's going to be about socialism. And you're doing some good work over there, Rob, and thanks for being on the Denise Simon Experience.
It's great to be with you, and thank you for your support and readership of the Daily Signal. We certainly appreciate it.
Indeed so. Okay, we have this building thing. Socialism is acceptable. Socialism is becoming commonplace. And I argue that it is, the blame falls with education. And I would say that we've had a real void in this whole educational system probably for the last 20 years or so, if not more. Would that be right?
Well, that's certainly true. I think it probably extends farther back than that, but certainly it has intensified in the last couple of decades. And it really does. You know, I've interviewed the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, and asked her about this. And she herself, who probably has a better perspective and certainly an expertise in this area, given her position, who says that it's the lack of teaching about civics and the foundations of our country. And what happens is that if students don't get that foundational education when they're in kindergarten through 12th grade, they go to these colleges and universities where the professors are, in many cases, ardent believers in socialism. So they're certainly not going to get that foundational principle when they get to college. And what does that mean? When you look at polling of young people, when you look at polling of Democrats, socialism is certainly on the rise. And I think it's troubling because they're not being told the truth about socialism.
Okay, I'm going to be snarky. She's the Secretary of Education. Why can't the Department of Education mandate that we start teaching economics again and free marketplace, capitalism, and then civics?
Well, this is where I think you have a conflict, because conservatives, as you know, always want to push those decisions at the lowest level possible. So we don't want the federal government coming in and telling local schools what to do, because yes, President Trump is in the White House now, but a couple years from now or 8 years from now or whenever, you know, the next Democrat is in there, will they be then able to dictate from Washington what schools are supposed to do? And we fought against that as conservatives, and I think we probably want to adhere to that same principle. Now, that being said, I think that there's a number of things that conservatives could do to make some changes. One of the first and foremost is to be get involved in, if you're a parent, your child's education. Make sure you're communicating with the teachers. You have an expectation for what that you want them to do in the classroom. You could take it a step further. You could run for a local school board and actually have a seat at the table and make sure that those local schools are doing things in a way that were done in the past and should be returned to today.
Well said. I would argue that we've got the Department of Education that has installed a whole bunch of other kinds of things, least of which is Common Core, into the syllabus. So I think, kind of challenging the school systems on where in the syllabus you have economics and you have civics would be at least a starting point, correct?
I agree with you that there are, and I think that's in some cases what Secretary DeVos has attempted to do just by even raising the issue and talking about it. Let's face it, when she made some of these comments to the Daily Signal, there were a number of your typical left-leaning publications that latched onto them and kind of were calling her out and saying that she was doing something, because I think they recognize that they pretty much do have a monopoly right now. So when anybody is going to challenge the status quo, there's concern about that. I do have to say, as a father myself, and I have a son who's studying Virginia history right now, because that's something that you do in the fourth grade. I do feel like there is a pretty good and comprehensive discussion, and we're only a couple of months into the school year, but I've been impressed so far. So I don't think this is happening in school districts everywhere. I think that there are some who probably do a better job than others, but the fact of the matter is that it probably needs to be a part of the curriculum from the day you start in kindergarten all through the day that you depart in 12th grade. And so much is now being done, in terms of teaching to the test. And you mentioned some of the Common Core philosophies. Learning is very different for students today than it was for even my generation, and certainly generations that have come before.
Oh boy, is it ever. You've got some skin in the game. I don't have skin in the game anymore, but I can certainly see where, not only do we have this existing generation, 30 years old and younger perhaps, that have subscribed into socialism, but I think some of these parents are victims of kind of converted cultural thinking too. So we also have an adult, older adult component that's probably been victimized. Rob, at what point did we go from civics to social studies?
That's a good question. I mean, certainly before my time, I had social studies, and I graduated, over 20 years ago. So I mean, there was probably a time in I guess maybe the 80s or so. Look, remember, the Department of Education itself in Washington was created by Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s. And remember, Ronald Reagan and other conservatives at the time said one of their priorities was to get rid of the Department of Education because they didn't really feel that Washington should be interfering at that level. I mean, I think that's probably true for a number of agencies that exist in Washington that liberal administrations have created. But you have a situation where, yes, you're right, there has been so much top-down that we need to reverse engineer it, and we need to make sure that we're empowering people at a local level. And by the way, most important is the ability and the opportunity for parents to make a decision where their kids get that education. Just because I choose a public school for my children doesn't mean that another parent who might live next door to me shouldn't be able to choose a different schooling option for theirs. And we've made it very difficult in many parts of the country for people to do that. In some cases because they don't have the means or financial ability to do that. In other cases just because we've put up roadblocks. But school choice is really something that I think could transform this very debate that we're having today.
For the sake of the listeners, is there a distinction or a definition of the difference between democratic socialism and socialism?
Well, if you ask the democratic socialists, that they would certainly say that there is, and they try to use that word democratic because they believe that probably holds better, and it denotes that they're trying to separate themselves from some of the tyrannical regimes that we know as being socialist, whether you look at Venezuela or the policies that have decimated Cuba. Places like that certainly don't necessarily carry that democratic label, because look at who's running them. I mean, there's not even a democratic government in place. the fact of the matter is, if you look at the policies, though, that they're advocating, whether it's a democratic socialist like Bernie Sanders, and again, that's his label. You look at Medicare for all, right? I mean, this would eliminate private health insurance. It would outlaw any sort of health care outside of the government system. And that ultimately means it's going to reduce the access to health care and probably dramatically increase wait times. So is that what we really want? And yet you look at it and they propose this as, oh, it's this free solution and we're just going to tax the rich and we'll all be better off at the end of the day. But I think when people start to look at what the consequences of a decision like that is, hopefully that starts to shift the public opinion about something like Medicare for all.
Well, we've got socialism all throughout government, and I don't think that the conservatives and the Republicans have done a very good job at, putting red check marks of all the programs that we have in government that are really socialist programs. And I would argue, at least of which is, entitlements. Government paid unemployment.
Well, you can look at a number of them. I think that there's a combination of what you're describing, and then there are also those programs which may be capitalist in nature, but they reward. They are really corrupt, cronyist. They're the types of things where major corporations are getting government handouts and then get a leg up on the little guys, and you basically destroy competition in the free market. All of those are what's contributing to some of the issues that we're seeing. I think this is one of the reasons that when Donald Trump came to Washington, he said he wanted to drain the swamp, because he wanted to take a close look at these programs and get rid of those that didn't work. Now, you have an entrenched bureaucracy and establishment in Washington that will fight tooth and nail to keep these programs because they want the status quo. They like the benefits that they're currently getting, and they're going to resist any kind of reform or change. And that's, I think, what has made Trump, in some cases, so unpopular, because he's unafraid to challenge them on this.
I hate to inject the NRA, but I'm only going to use it for reference. The NRA gives politicians a grade on the Second Amendment. I would think at some point we would have Heritage Foundation or maybe others that would start giving that same kind of grade to those legislators that are socialist proponents, sympathizers, encouragers. Is there such a thing that can happen?
I think it's probably a good idea, particularly as more and more people identify as socialists. I mean, you have a number of candidates who are certainly running for office in the midterm elections this year. They are not. They're embracing the label. They're not shying away from it at all. Now, in some of those cases, that's because they are in such a safe seat or a district where those views would be tolerated, that they're able to get away with it. Eric Bolling, who's the former Fox News host, said that when he referred to President Obama's policies as socialist, he was reprimanded and told that was too drastic and extreme of a word to use in reference. And then today, you look at how far we've come in the last 8 years, and it's openly embraced. I mean, Bernie Sanders makes no bones about it. I mean, he's proud to stand as a socialist. So I think that it's troubling. I think that the news media has not done a service to the American people by exposing what the true costs of these programs are. That's one of the reasons that the Daily Signal exists, and whether or not you produce a letter grade or there's other ways to get the message out, I think it's absolutely needed.
So let's have a congressional hearing on socialism, and if we do, what committee would necessarily host a congressional hearing on the cancer of socialism, and what are the things that should be presented in a congressional hearing?
Wow, I bet you could almost have every committee examine different aspects of it. I mean, well, look, let's face it. I mean, if you've got a committee that deals with education, they may look at some component of it from that perspective. If you have a committee that's that deals with health. I mean, you can have them look at it. But if you're talking more broadly, I think that it's probably something that like an oversight committee might be able to do something on. I mean, the White House, in fact, just recently released a report about the economic costs of socialism. So there are places in government, that was the Council of Economic Advisors, by the way, there are people in government who can take a close look at this and I think produce some of the warnings that are necessary. I think the challenge comes back to the fact that I think so many people in the news media are uninterested in telling this story. I mean, they are happy to condemn capitalism and the free markets at every opportunity that they have. And you have the same thing happening in academia and all parts of education. And yet, and then you never hear about the downside or the consequences. And you try to make a comparison to a Venezuela or Cuba, as I did earlier in the interview, and we're told, oh, that's not the type of socialism we're talking about. We're talking about Denmark and other countries. Well, here's the thing they don't tell you about Denmark. Denmark is one of the freest economies in the world. And for them to describe it as socialist is an insult to Denmark.
I almost see a documentary out of this. I mean, if it can't be necessarily a congressional hearing, I see where a documentary, and it needs to be, on HBO or on, broadcast news. Not that it would ever get there, but there's some real lessons here that have long since been forgotten about, capitalism in the free market system. And I would say that we're truly cheating, probably at least half of the population in the United States, because they've long since forgotten where we should be and the consequences of socialism. And we can go from government to government to government across the globe and demonstrate the causes and consequences of capitalism, right, Rob?
You're absolutely correct. And we have some great people who are doing that. I mean, one of the best, I think, is the economist Walter Williams, who writes a weekly column for the Daily Signal. And I'd encourage your listeners to look at his work because as an economist, I mean, he looks at the real costs of socialism. I mean, there are costs on numerous levels. I mean, you're talking about the cost of freedom. I mean, do we really want to sacrifice our freedom and the great virtues that our country is built on? Because socialism doesn't allow that. Socialism puts power in the hands of the government, and the government will dictate to us whether it's healthcare or education or the economy. I mean, you name it, the government is going to take over increasing role in our lives. And then you look at the benefits. I mean, you can look at policies like the minimum wage. Do we really want everybody to be under the minimum wage? I don't want
so. Minimum wage at all.
Wage
that's me.
Is so restrictive, right? Exactly.
I want it to go away. Period.
Well, because the economic data is there. I mean, there's just so much proof that Americans are better off if they're able to operate without the government imposing these kind of mandates and restrictions on private businesses. And that's how our country has flourished. And I think that's what we need to get back to. We need to do a better job of telling those success stories about the free market, about capitalism. And I think that will help counter socialism. And I think everybody should go back and read Animal Farm and see some of the consequences that George Orwell pointed out many, many years ago during the last fad when we had the rise of the Soviet Union and other countries promoting an even more aggressive form through communism.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're speaking with Rob Bluey, the editor-in-chief of the Daily Signal. For this generation that we're speaking of, particularly Rob, there's a bunch of hypocrisy. I don't think that they subscribe to socialism, but I don't think they fully understand it because, I mean, how many of them have a cell phone, an iPhone, for instance, which came from what? It came from the free enterprise system, right?
You are absolutely. I'm so glad you brought up that point. The iPhone, Uber, Airbnb, all of these companies that have emerged within the last decade or so, and the technology that we're now able to embrace and improve
Instagram,
our lives in so many ways.
Snapchat,
exactly. Those would not exist in a socialist socialist society. There's absolutely no question about them. And yet, who's embracing them most, if not the millennial generation and other young Americans? So they don't understand the connection there. And I think it's important to point that out, that many of the luxuries that they're living with today are a direct result of the capitalist free market system that we live in, and wouldn't be possible in a socialist society.
So if you were a guest speaker at an economics class at, say, the University of Pittsburgh, and you had to give a 10-minute speech on socialism versus capitalism, what high points would you make, Rob?
Well, I think one of the most, we've covered a lot of them, but I think one of the most important comes down to freedom, because what American doesn't appreciate the freedom that they have to live in this great country? And if you start taking away things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and the government starts dictating to you how you should live your life, I think that that's the type of thing that you can point to in other countries and say, this is the consequence of socialism. I think that would be my first point. I think the second point, a lot of it comes down to economics. I think you don't want to have a situation where so much of our life is dependent on the government setting controls for the economy, determining the health care that we can get, making so many of those other choices. Socialism takes away freedom and choice in lives, and it was destructive in so many ways, and it leads to misery and suffering. And we've seen that in so many other countries. So my final point would be to show some of those real life examples, probably through images and visuals, to if I was teaching a class, and say, this is not what we want to bring to the United States.
Okay, and so then you get this student in the class that says, well, we do this whole corporate welfare thing, and we've got, the government in a lot of cases that are bailing out what we would call successful corporations under the capitalistic system. What would you say?
Well, I as a free market conservative, I certainly don't support that. So, I mean, I think that's where you have this establishment, cronyist mentality in Washington, which continues to operate things like the Export-Import Bank, which gives
yes,
a significant amount of government money to companies that really shouldn't get it. And so we need to fight against that. And what I tell that student is, that is not capitalism. That is not the free markets. That is a distortion of that. That's a cronyist policy, and we need to fight against that as well, because I understand the concerns that are associated with that, and that's where I remain optimistic, because I think there are people on the right and the left in this country who could come together and end something like that, but it's going to take draining the swamp in Washington to do it.
Well, you mentioned the Export-Import Bank, and I'm not a very, in fact, I was pretty happy when that was sort of going away. But we have this other thing, and that's called CIPA, CIPA, which is, I think, what the government does capital investments into third world countries. We got a whole big thing going on with the federal government and the Catholic, whatever it is, in Latin America for clean water. What in the world are we doing in that kind of business too?
Well, there's a number of areas, and I'm no expert on that one, but I mean, there's a number of areas where the government has its hands in things that it would probably be best to leave to, civil society organizations, nonprofits, church groups. One of the things the Daily Signal recently did was travel to South Carolina and follow how people are recovering from the hurricane. Mm-hmm. And you know what we found? We found it wasn't the government that was coming in and making a difference. It was private organizations like Samaritan's Purse, local churches, community groups, neighbors helping neighbors. Those are the people who are making a difference. And I think that we need to change the mindset in this country that just because you have a natural disaster or a problem in a foreign country, that the government's going to come in and fix it. That is not the approach that this country was founded on. And we need to get back to that notion of those little platoons that Edmund Burke talked about, helping each other out.
Well, you make an awful lot of great points here. Certainly, just get the government out of stuff. I mean, communities are stronger because of their contributions into natural disasters like we've had in Harvey and Irma and the rest of them. And that's where the rubber hits the road. And, I mean, they may need some big help, like with the power companies in Puerto Rico. Some of that I do get, But nonetheless, Puerto Rico it was really socialist, and then we saw it because of the failure of their entire power grid. So we're just kind of all over the place. It's just socialism is just prevalent all over government, right?
Oh, well, yes. I mean, it is, as the federal government continues to expand into areas that really should be best handled by either state governments or local governments, or in some cases just communities, that's where I think you run the risk of doing exactly what our founders wanted to avoid. I mean, they really did believe in this federalist system where the power would be spread out and you wouldn't have this centralized authority and massive federal government. The federal government, first and foremost, should protect us. The Constitution spells right out, looking out for the common defense of the American people. And there are a number of things that it also states that the federal government should do. And if you look down the line over the course of time, you see an expansion. That's why, let's face it, every time there's a new government program, it's very difficult. We can look no further than Obamacare in this regard. Remember how excited Republicans were to repeal Obamacare? I mean, they campaigned on this time and time again. They had the opportunity to do it, and they couldn't get it done. Now, I think that's one of those things where they can't give up on something like that, because once it becomes entrenched in the bureaucracy in Washington, it's only going to grow. It's not going to diminish.
Indeed so. And once it's entrenched, not only does it grow, there's no way to get it to go away. I mean, it just won't go away because the will and the gravitas, the fire in the belly isn't there because there's too many other crises that have to be addressed, correct?
Exactly. I mean, there's always a crisis in Washington, D.C. So there's always an excuse not to do something, right? I mean, there's a reason, and I think that there's also constituencies that come to emerge when a new government program is created, whose primary purpose is there to defend that government program, to do everything in its power to maintain that, and they'll find people in Congress who are unwilling to budge on the issue, or for whatever reason continue to protect it, and that's what we're faced on a day-to-day basis. And so the American people can't give up hope, though. They need to keep demanding that, as Trump said, that the swamp is drained, that changes are made, and that we get back to the founding principles of this great country.
Thank you, Mr. Rob Bluey, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience. We'll see you again very soon.